Okay, folks, welcome to another deep dive where we, as always, are going to be taking a look at a single source
Mhm.
and really trying to unpack and analyze it. Today, we're going to be looking at a clip from a recent Joe Rogan Experience episode.
Oh, wow.
Now, for those of you who maybe aren't familiar with Joe Rogan, he's a comedian
Right.
and a very popular podcaster. And his podcast is kind of a freewheeling conversation he has on all kinds of guests,
Yeah.
from scientists and
Maybe the
academics,
sense.
comedians and athletes and all kinds of people. But in this particular clip we're going to be looking at, he is talking about Justin Trudeau,
Okay.
Prime Minister of Canada. And Rogan doesn't hold back. He makes some pretty strong statements about Trudeau and Canadian politics in general. So
Yeah.
we bred in an expert.
To help us unpack some of these statements
Yeah.
and analyze them. So maybe let's start with what is Rogan's sort of main argument here?
Well, I think Rogan's main point is that he sees Justin Trudeau as leading Canada down a path toward what he calls legitimate communism.
And he uses this to describe policies such as restrictions on free speech and internet expression.
Yeah, and he doesn't mince words here. I mean, he uses some very colorful language to describe Trudeau.
Right.
I won't repeat the actual words he used here, but
Sure.
he makes it very clear that he is not a fan of the Canadian Prime Minister. One of the things that really stood out to me was this idea of Rogan connecting what's happening in Canada to the U.S.
Uh-huh.
He says they're on the same patch of land as us.
Yeah.
What do you make of that?
Well, I think that's a really interesting point because it suggests that Rogan sees what's happening in Canada as having potential implications for the U.S. as well.
Right.
You know, it's not just something that's happening up in Canada that doesn't affect us down here.
Right.
It really taps into this broader conversation about U.S.-Canada relations. You know, it's a complex relationship.
Absolutely.
It has a long history. And I think Rogan's perspective probably resonates with some Americans, particularly those who are concerned about the spread of certain political ideologies.
But, it's important to keep in mind that this is just one perspective.
Of course.
And it doesn't necessarily reflect the views of all Americans.
Sure.
Or even a majority of Americans.
Absolutely. I mean, you can't extrapolate one person's views to an entire country.
Right, exactly.
Now, let's talk a little bit about this word communism
Okay.
that Rogan keeps using. It's a pretty loaded term, right?
Oh, it's a very loaded term.
Like, what kind of historical baggage comes with that word?
Well, it evokes a lot of, 20th century history, particularly from the Cold War era.
Right.
It's associated with authoritarian regimes, state control of the economy, suppression of individual liberties.
Yeah.
So it can be a very triggering word for a lot of people.
So when Rogan uses this word, is he using it in a historically accurate way?
Well, that's a good question, and I think it's important to remember that communism isn't a monolithic concept. There are actually a lot of different forms and interpretations of communism.
Oh, interesting. You have the authoritarian regimes that we often associate with the term,
Right.
but you also have more democratic socialist ideals that fall under the umbrella of communism.
Okay.
So when someone uses this word in a political debate, I think it's really crucial to understand exactly what they mean.
Right.
Are they referring to specific economic policies, limits on individual freedoms, or something else entirely?
It seems to me that Rogan is using this word, communism, as more of a catch-all term for any policy that he disagrees with.
Yeah, seems that way.
Particularly policies that he sees as limiting individual freedoms.
Right.
But he never really gets into the specifics of those policies or how they might or might not align with different interpretations of communism.
Yeah, I think you're right. He's using it more as a rhetorical device than as a precise, analytical term.
Gotcha. And this is where things get really interesting. Because Rogan insists throughout this that he's not political.
Huh.
He says that he doesn't identify with either party. But then he makes these very politically charged statements.
Yeah, it's an interesting contradiction.
So how do we square that circle?
Well, I think it's important to recognize that even if someone doesn't explicitly identify with a particular party, their rhetoric can still reveal certain political leanings. And this brings up a bigger issue, I think, which is political polarization.
Okay.
We live in a world where it seems like everyone is expected to pick a side. And those sides are becoming increasingly entrenched and hostile toward one another.
So how do figures like Joe Rogan, who have these massive platforms and millions of listeners, how do they navigate this really polarized landscape?
Yeah, it's a tough question.
I mean, they have a lot of power
They do.
to shape public opinion,
Absolutely.
potentially even influence political outcomes.
Absolutely.
So do they have a responsibility to be more careful with their words?
That's a big debate.
Yeah.
Some people argue that figures with large platforms have a responsibility to be more careful with their language, to avoid inflammatory rhetoric, and to present a more balanced perspective. Others say, look, they have the right to free speech. They can say whatever they want, regardless of how controversial it might be.
I mean, that's the classic free speech debate, right?
Exactly.
Where do we draw the line? Between protecting individual expression and preventing harm.
Right.
So in Rogan's case, do you think his comments about Trudeau are actually contributing to the very polarization that he claims to be against?
Well, I think it's possible, by using such strong language and framing the issue in such stark terms, he might actually be further entrenching existing divisions rather than fostering any kind of productive dialogue.
Right, and we haven't even gotten into Trudeau's response to any of this or how Canadian politicians and citizens are reacting. So this is really just scratching the surface.
Yeah, this is a very complex issue. So there's a lot more to unpack here.
For sure. So we've given our listeners a lot to think about. What do you think is the most important question for them?
I think the most important question is, where do we go from here? Rogan has sparked a conversation. Whether you agree with him or not, he's gotten people talking. So I think it's up to each of us to decide. Do we think figures like Rogan should be more mindful of their language? Or is this simply a case of free speech in action? I don't think there's an easy answer.
Yeah.
But I do think it's a question worth wrestling with.
Well said. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.
It was my pleasure.
And to all of our listeners out there, keep those brains buzzing, keep asking those tough questions, and we'll see you next time.